Hello, could you take your seats, please? I think we're ready to get started. A very, very warm welcome to the first, we hope, annual University of Oregon Disability Studies Forum. Woo! I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Disability Studies Initiative here at U of O. I am Betsy Wheeler, also known as Elizabeth Wheeler, and I teach in the English department here at University of Oregon. And I'd like to introduce my co-organizers, who are Deborah Olson, professor in special education, and Heidi van Ravensburg from the College of Education and the Law School. And first of all, I would like to thank our sponsors and staff who have made this event so wonderfully possible. First of all, the College of Arts and Sciences, Judith Baskin, Associate Dean of Humanities, the Department of English, Karen Ford, the department head, and the superhuman staff members Marilyn Reed, Liesl Haggis, and especially Beth McGee, who many of you have emailed to RSVP and who designed our beautiful poster. And the University Center for Excellence on Developmental Disabilities, Jane Squires, director, and also want to thank Jane Squires and USED for being long-term supporters of disability studies here at University of Oregon. Also want to thank USED staff members Annette Tognazzini and Leslie Martinez. The Office of Academic Affairs, Doug Blandy, Senior Vice Provost, and also long-term supporter of disability studies here at U of O and elsewhere. And the Center for the Study of Women in Society, Carol Stabile, Director and great encourager. And the Graduate School of the University of Oregon, and the Accessible Education Center, Hillary Gerdes, Senior Director. So thank you so much to all our sponsors who made us feel that this was possible and provided the funds and the staff to make it happen. So. All right, I want to tell you a little bit about the order of events today. We're going to start out with 4 speakers from the University of Oregon working in disability studies and related fields. First of all, we'll hear from 2 University of Oregon faculty members, Francis Bronette and Michael Hames Garcia, and everyone will be introduced at greater length in a minute. And 2 graduate student speakers working in disability studies, Lori Kahn and Veronica Vold. Then we'll have lunch, and during lunch, you'll also have an opportunity to look at our table that's behind the screen, and what we have there is information about the Accessibility Graduate Student Union here at University of Oregon, and also information about Mobility International USA and their new book, and we'll talk about that more at greater length later on, but remind me the title, Sue. Brilliant and Resilient, Celebrating the Power of Disabled Women Activists. And then we will have our guest speakers whom we have brought here from afar, Professor Ann Fox from Davidson College in North Carolina, and Professor Mel Chen from UC Berkeley. And before I go, I want to let you know about a couple of disability studies organizations happening here on campus. One is, I want to let you know about the Disability Studies Research Interest Group, which has been formed through the Center for the Study of Women in Society, and we are definitely looking for new members, both graduate students and faculty and administrators. If you are interested, you can get in touch with me. My email is E for Elizabeth, E Wheeler at University of Oregon, or you can talk to me. Or you can just contact the Center for the Study of Women in Society. We will be having a meeting this term. And what else do I want to tell you? Also, if anybody would like to join us in the Disability Studies Initiative, we would be very, very happy to have you and to have you help us organize, we hope, the 2nd annual Disability Studies Forum. So, welcome to the party. And next I would like to introduce Dean Judith Baskin of the College of Arts and Sciences to give a welcome from CAS. Thank you.
Thanks, Betsy, and to all of you who helped organize this really important event. I'm delighted to offer words of welcome from the College of Arts and Sciences. We were very pleased to give a program grant to this event, and we look forward to applications in the future. And not just humanities, but actually all my colleagues, social sciences, natural sciences, and our acting dean, Andrew Marcus, send their best regards. This is a very exciting event. I'm very proud that the University of Oregon is in the forefront of disability studies as a research focus, as well as disability consciousness on our campus. And I'm very glad to be here and look forward to listening to this initial panel. So thanks to all of you for being here and for helping make this event possible. Thank you.
So I'm Jane Squires from the University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. That's a big mouthful. We're an organization that has 67 centers nationally. We're lucky enough to have 2 in Oregon, one here and one at the Health Sciences University. And we have been involved with disability studies and really trying to raise consciousness about disabilities around campus for many years. And it's really exciting to see an event like this, which really is truly cross-campus, that people give lip service about. We really need to collaborate, but I think this is a great example, so it's very exciting. I have the pleasure to introduce the local talent, and often they get kind of ignored, I think, when we bring in experts, and often they are of equal status to our experts that we bring far. They're just on the same time zone, which has like a really big advantage often. So Frances Bronnett is the Dean of the School of Architecture and Allied Arts, and she truly is an interdisciplinary master or mistress or whatever, maestro. She does multidisciplinary design curriculum between architecture, engineering, science, technology, and society, dance, and electronic arts. And looking at her bios and some of the products, like collaborations with dance companies, is just really fascinating. So I can't wait to hear you speak, Frances.
I just want to say the first lack of access is probably this right here. Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk. We have a very short period of time, and there's going to be hopefully some questions, and we won't have any time to answer them. So we'll take them over at Lawrence Hall over the course of the next few years. So let me just start with, I'm actually an architect and an engineer, and in order to teach first-year design studios to students who had never really experienced different kinds of spaces than the ones that they grew up in, we tried to come up with exercises where they would understand the spaces that they inhabited. And I'm going to start with this space that we all walked into, and you all knew immediately what you were going to do in this space. This is what I would call a ready-made space. You walk in the door, and you knew what to do. We were trying to look at what it means to develop space in the making, space that actually responded to the way that your body moves. And so what we were trying to do is get combinations of people. I call them dancers, action artists, you can call them whatever you want. Many of us are just inhabitants, to offer an alternative to what we call ready-made space. And the alternative space in the making actually comes from Bruno Latour's concept of ready-made science versus science in the making, and whether if you change the context, does the experiment change? And I really do believe that space in the making is a way to develop space generated by the movements of how we actually move together and move separately. And so you can imagine that that means all of us are activists in developing space. And in fact, dancers or action artists will take risks with their bodies that perhaps most of us wouldn't. So we were able to play with the extreme notion of movement with different kinds of companies. So the project started with whatever company was local, and this was when I was living in Troy, New York, near Albany, and the local company was a company called the Ellinsonopoli Dance Company, and we developed space that would respond or beat a path in the way that you might beat a path when you cross-country ski. If you open up a forest because you've made a path, it'll close up when you leave. If 1,000 people went through, that space might be there for a season. So how can we actually beat paths with our bodies? This space will look the same when you leave, by the way. So this is not a space in the making in any way, shape, or form. How can we actually develop space as a kind of collision? So different kinds of spaces that we've had. Actually, if the lights could just come down a little bit, you might be able to see this better. And so part of it is also, what is the context? And in this context, these were the companies I had, these were the people I had. We actually started this project here. I had accepted to do this large-scale project before I took the job as dean, and so I had to now travel back and forth. And the project actually began here with students from dance and psychology and education, architecture, and landscape architecture. And when we did this here, we used inner tubes from bicycles. Because they're ubiquitous and there's millions of them around. When we went to Troy, they didn't have any. You know, you just take it for granted. So again, what is the context and what can you do? They had lots of spandex though. And so these are spandex elements, thousands of elastic bands that wrap around this incredible wall. So fundamentally, the thesis is that the space of the project emerges from the specific context. The way the dancers or inhabitants move, the containers, the materials, and then ultimately how you would view it would be independently resolved. How do we meet Danceability? So those of you, I'm sure most of you in this room know Danceability. It's an incredible company, dance company run by Alito Alessi, has a couple of permanent dance company members, one of them Emery Blackwell, who's also an activist. And Danceability International works with everybody to make every one of us a dancer. That if you have parts, you can be a performer. And I don't know how we met. I can't even remember. I think it might have been at a dance concert. And we just connected, and the rest is magic. So we started a class together where Alito, dance students, architecture students, we started to look at how different bodies, all of us, move in space and what could we make that would really push the limits of our body, anybody. So this was our first project in the School of Architecture, a kind of muscular big chair that moved. And it was interesting because everybody had to be able to move on this cradle, and the project actually opened and closed, allowed for people to get on with or without chairs. And interestingly enough, so this is part of the interim presentation at near the middle of the term. Alito has vanished, he's on international tour, and the dancers will take certain risks. And then Alito shows up on the last day and says, this is ridiculous. We've got to get that chair on top of the structure. And the level of risk that he's willing to do with his performers challenged everything that I would have done, certainly. So the collaboration continued. But while this is going on, the context of what's emerging at the School of Architecture and Allied Arts is also developing. So two things. One is we have in our audience Kyo Ho-an, who's one of the faculty members in interior architecture, and he teaches a course called Understanding Contemporary Interiors, in which he takes at some level for granted that we are going to design spaces that are open for everybody. And it's a very significant part of that curriculum for Kyo Ho and his students. At the same time, We have product design dealing with returning veterans, and who in this particular case are extreme athletes. Oops. Okay, I'm going to mess this up. So in product design, we were working with veterans who had returned from various wars and still wanted to be extraordinary athletes. Some of them had not been athletes before the war, some of them had been, and a set of projects emerged that would enhance or transform their abilities. This was an interesting context for us because the language of the product designers was really radically different than the language of what I had learned from Alito. So I had brought Alito Alessi, who's the head choreographer, over to the Wounded Warriors review, and it was a very interesting engagement because of the students and how they talked about the veterans as one group of people and the work they did as separate from that. Alito's critique brought that up, and one of the athletes after the event and the review said, if everyone understood that, I probably wouldn't need these enhancements. So it was a remarkable moment. So the last collaboration, and I'm going to do some absolutely shameless advertising for two things. One is this performance that is on your table and is going to happen on November 1st, and is a collaboration with Danceability and students of architecture and fine arts at the University of Oregon, dancers from the University of Oregon, Lane Community College, and Danceability. And the project began as a very specific one, looking at Karen Daly and Emery Blackwell. Karen Daly on the left, Emery on the left here, and developing projects that we would have to be challenged at some level. So these boxes emerged. How could they work? What would they do to the dancer's body? And what's the relationship? Ultimately, these boxes were clothing, armatures, furniture, and structure. The project evolves into something called Don't Leave Me, which is opening this week, thinking about them as vehicles as well, and how we actually engage space. Various iterations, of course, we're still rehearsing. I don't know if anybody was able to see some of it, very, very tiny bit of it in the library a couple of weeks ago. And then ultimately, the idea, and you know, Alito is desperate to tell us that we're challenging the box, outside the box. And I said, you know, we don't talk about that. We'll let you think about those things. But now that I've planted it in your brain, you've got it. And thinking about how we actually develop space that responds to very specific bodies. These boxes were designed very, very meticulously around the lengths of the kinds of bodies that we were activating. So I'm going to end here. The second shameless plug is, you know, I don't know how to write. I'd love to have a collaborator. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can see the dance at lunchtime or something, because is that what it was? I'd love to.
The athletic performers.
Yes, the athletic performers. Okay, so second I'm going to introduce Dr. Michael Hames Garcia, who is in the Department of Ethnic Studies and the Director for the Center for Race, Ethnicity, and Sexuality Studies, and said that he will be taking over the Center for the Study of Women in Society next year. So he has a very interesting portfolio of activities. And as I was walking in, one of the students was saying, oh, I just can't wait to hear him, because I've read everything that he's written, and he's just the most awesome writer about our multiple senses of identity. And I thought that was probably the best introduction I could give. So.
Does anyone else need the computer? Is it okay if I close it? Hi. I I want to thank Betsy for inviting me here and for all of the organizers for helping put this all together. In her invitation, Betsy had said to be brief and informal, so I'm going to endeavor to be both. So what she asked me to talk about was the relation of disability, or the place of disability studies in my own scholarship. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But first I want to say that I first discovered disability studies maybe, I guess, 15 years ago when I was in New York, upstate New York at SUNY Binghamton, and one of my colleagues was Leonard Davis. And then I later formed a friendship with Tobin Siebers, and so the two of them were really my introduction to disability studies. And my immediate contact with it was a sort of rethinking of some personal issues, right? So thinking about issues of privilege, certainly, but also profoundly rethinking my own relation to my body and beginning to think of the various ways in which I'm able-bodied. And so that was really the first place that I engaged with disability studies. Later, in my own work, specifically my latest book, Identity Complex, I engaged with disability studies primarily in the context of reading the HBO television series Oz. Any Oz fans in the audience? It's getting older and older, so there's fewer and fewer fans around. My interest there is in how disability colludes with race, gender, and sexuality through the portrayal of one of the main characters, the paraplegic character Augustus Hill. In essence, I argue that the series creators use the trope of disabilities to humanize the character, right? So this is something that many people have written about. As a black man in prison, Hill is necessarily understood as threatening. Therefore, he and other black characters in the series must be tamed in some way to be acceptable within the traditional bounds of television protagonists. This entails, among other things, their becoming in some way less sexually threatening, specifically. So in Hill's case, his disability is used to explicitly to desexualize the character. Thus, what is at stake in the character of Hill is not his sexuality, or his maleness, or his blackness, or his disability, but rather the conjunction of the four. So although most visible in his case, I argue that the conjunction of sexuality, gender, race, and embodiment as either able-bodied or disabled, or super able-bodied, is part of any individual's positioning within the modern colonial gender system. The modern colonial gender system describes the long 500-year structuring of knowledge and resources around axes of capitalism, colonialism, and Eurocentrism that sustains unequal life chances among the world's population. How one is situated within the colonial modern gender system has as much bearing on how one is understood as able-bodied or disabled as it does with how one is racialized. Unpack that a little bit. In readings like my reading of Oz, I am therefore motivated by a sense of the inextricability of race, gender, sexuality, and disability, or able-bodiedness, from one another. We can see that extricability everywhere, and I think an addition of a disability studies perspective is vitally necessary for ethnic studies and the study of race. For example, able-bodiedness is part of what makes whiteness desirable, as disability can be a disqualifying factor in determining whiteness. Generations of immigrants have thus had to prove physical fitness before being allowed to enter the United States. By contrast, the stigmatizing of African descent peoples has oscillated historically between portrayals of them as physically unfit, as in racist depictions of them as prone to disease or mentally incompetent, or as superfit, as in racist depictions of them as natural athletes, or as possessing unnatural sexual potency. In both cases, what interests me is the use of these portrayals to distance black people from an understanding of the normal parameters for a human body. With the baseline for that understood as a white body, a European body. Thus, to understand how the categories of both whiteness and blackness are deployed and maintained, ethnic studies scholars should have access to a range of disability studies concepts. Furthermore, I would argue that the intersections of ability-disability with race-ethnicity are most visible when we also understand race bodies as gendered. Just then, as I would argue against the utility of theoretical frameworks that presuppose a conception of race without gender or gender without race, I would argue against an elaboration of account of disability that does not understand bodies as both raced and gendered. And so that's all I have. So.
Hi, my name is Susan Siegel, and I have the pleasure of introducing Lori Gutman-Kahn. And Lori is a University of Oregon doctoral candidate in special education. Her dissertation focuses on the experiences of young adults with disabilities who identify as sexual or gender minorities. And I will also add that I had the pleasure of having Lori in a class that we teach at the University of Oregon called Global Perspectives on Disability, so it is a double pleasure to introduce her. Lori?
Hi, good afternoon. First and foremost, I would love to thank the committee and Betsy Wheeler for organizing such an important event, and I feel very honored to be up here presenting my research alongside such inspiring scholars. So thank you, everybody, for coming as well. And thank you, Susan, as well, for that introduction. It's great to see you again. My name is Lori Gutman-Kahn, and like Susan said, I'm a doctoral candidate in special education, and I'm thrilled to be here presenting my dissertation research on the experiences, beliefs, and identity of young adults with a disability who identify as a sexual or gender minority. So before sort of getting into conceptualizing my dissertation research within the context of disability studies, I'd like to tell you a little bit about how I came into the field. I am currently a novice teacher and researcher. However, my heart and my full identity places me in the classroom as a teacher. And so I have personal experiences sort of watching young adults with disabilities navigate their landscapes and using the tools and techniques and the labels that they're either given or assigned to navigate those landscapes. So that sort of brings me to my research interests and to choosing my dissertation topic of research. My students, let's see, so I am currently working with 8 young adults with disabilities who have a wide range of identities, but they all identify as a sexual or gender minority. The only thing that really unifies my students is that they all voluntarily agreed to enter into conversations with me. So they have a wide spectrum of experiences, of beliefs, of identities, and they, yeah, it's been fantastic. They all are within the state of Oregon, and they all participate in a series of 3 or more conversations with me where they are able to communicate their narratives about their experiences within the school, within their home life, and within their own communities. So I decided to really dive deep into this work because as I have been doing my work within the field of special education, I realized that the majority of the work that comes before us situates disability within the medical model, which labels the idea of identities that are atypical as deviant, deficient, needing intervention, needing to be fixed. And so what really was important to me was that disability studies within education aims for problematizing such a framework and really understanding the social and the political organization that surrounds such an operationalization. So also one of the things that's very important to me is honoring the knowledge and the experiences of the individuals who experience the identities firsthand. So, yeah. My research also, can everybody hear me all right? Yeah, okay, great. My research aims to challenge the discourse that frames atypical bodies, minds, and voices as defective or deviant, putting into question the very notion that disability and queerness are fixed, are universal, that they are tangible and independent constructs. The purpose of this is to not only understand their own identities and beliefs and experiences, but also to understand how these unstable categories have differential impact upon the students who are either given or claim these labels for themselves. So to put it briefly, how do these young adults use these terms and tools to navigate their landscapes? Interestingly, I first began to understand the idea of how we understand queerness and disability by kind of looking at the similarities of some of the independent experiences, being that these are non-generational cultures. Most of the time, they might be the only individual within their families or within their communities that identify as such. Often, they're neglected when discussing the concept of multicultural and diversity. They also affect many ways in which gender are performed, depending upon the experience of the individual. Finally, they can be hidden or presented in different ways depending on the individual's experiences. And as a teacher, one of the things that I noticed as well was that both identities independently place a student at a greater risk for peer victimization and isolation within the schools. And that was something that just stood out to me, particularly as someone who as a teacher. So at this point, I have collected, or in the process of collecting, a series of 3 to 4 interviews with 8 youth. And I have found while doing my literature review and while reading up on my topic specifically, that there's an overwhelming amount of research that focuses on the negative outcomes for youth with disabilities, or for youth who identify as a sexual or gender minority. And a lot of the time, they frame it as almost like a double jeopardy. And one of the things that my research is aiming to do is to challenge that notion, saying it's not about having an additive experiences within the schools and the communities and home, but instead it's qualitatively different, and their experiences are mutually constitutive and really develop something unique. So, as far as what I have found so far, I'm in the process, like I said, of engaging in these conversations. And these youth just are very vocal, and they're very excited to be part of a project that's really trying to use the voices of the youth themselves. So as far as the experiences are concerned within the schools and the communities and their homes, these youth are navigating different ways of experiencing peer rejection and peer support. So what this means is, maybe experiencing peer rejection in some capacities allows them to be activists within the student body, or allows them to defend other people depending on how they are marginalized because of their categories of difference. So they also have found that a lot of the anti-bullying policies that have been developed within the schools actually can be sometimes more harmful than beneficial, because they end up just dealing with the specific issues causing sort of animosity in the school, instead of really examining issues of deep-seated homophobia, transphobia, and ableism that exists within school cultures. Other pieces of their own experiences is that they have found that being labeled as different has allowed them sort of more flexibility with their own identities, that they can, claim gender roles in very different ways. I was talking to one student last week who was talking about how, because he was given the diagnosis of autism, and he is starting to learn how to self-claim this label of being autistic, what that means to the way he performs gender, and that he has been much more comfortable with the label of different, and therefore he never felt the need to play football with the other boys, because he was always already comfortable being sort of marginalized within those social groups. And so because of that, it's allowed him to be more comfortable within developing as an adolescent who performs gender in a different way than his peers are really expecting of him. And so that brings into this whole idea of sense of self and identity. And a lot of what we're looking at, and what I'm just asking questions about, is how do students really understand the labels that are claimed or given? And when I say claimed or given, disability is often a label that is assigned to a youth, and it's something that they might or might not really enter into the process of identity development, whereas students who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, pansexual, queer, a lot of the time will sort of self-claim a lot of these labels and figure out what those mean to them on their own terms. And so sort of navigating both labels that are given and labels that are claimed for themselves can be sort of a challenging navigation process. It also has provided them with a lot of understanding of the ways in which their emotions drive sort of their decisions within the school context, whether that's pride, fear, isolation, rejection, belonging, anger, support. These are all different things that they have sort of a different context for being able to develop. And finally, a lot of what I love to talk about these youth is talking about what are their beliefs about the future? What do they want to be when they grow up? What do they see as the supports that they'll be able to access? What do they see as barriers? And there's some really interesting things that, that the students kind of experience and project. One being something as simple as location. Where is it that they want to live? If they're living in a small town here in Oregon, a lot of them, want to move to a larger city because they feel that that might be something that's more accepting of all aspects of their identity. So, finding a geographic and political environment that is both supportive and allows sort of the flexibility to understand all aspects of who they are. Second is choosing a career. So a lot of the time it's interesting to listen to their stories about how they want to both challenge and choose careers that might not have fixed gender roles or fixed gender assumptions. So a lot of students will choose careers that don't necessarily align with these fixed gender roles. And also they have questions about disclosure. When do they disclose different aspects of their identity? How do they do so? And this wraps up a lot into their rights as an individual and their self-advocacy, dealing with discrimination, and how they perceive they're going to deal with that discrimination later on. And finally, and probably one of the most interesting pieces, is how my students discuss their idea of finding community and find not just allies and not just mentors, but finding a community of individuals that will allow them to really to achieve all of the goals that they have outlined for themselves. So it's been such an honor to be able to work with these students and just to sit and listen and ask questions about the ways in which they challenge the assumptions that are sort of given to them by these associated labels, and ways in which they sort of either reject or claim them for themselves. So, yeah, thank you very much for letting me talk on about this research that I'm loving, and yeah, I hopefully will have some more details later on when I finish my dissertation. Thank you so much.
Next, I'd like to introduce Veronica Vold. Veronica Vold is a University of Oregon doctoral candidate in English, and her dissertation, entitled Graphic Ecologies, focuses on environmental health and illness in both graphic novels and in web comics. So let's give a big welcome and thank you to Veronica.
I'm truly thrilled to be here and to be a part of this growing community in this space, in this room. Thank you so much to the organizers who have put so much energy into gathering us and creating a space where we can meet and speak together. I look forward to the conversation that will continue this afternoon. The field of disability studies is capacious. There are so many lines of inquiry that take their axes here. And my own vector in disability studies concerns the politics of the body and the body's material connection to its environment. In other words, in my studies, I think about the environmental factors that produce and are produced by notions of disability and chronic illness. As a scholar of the environmental humanities, a field that strives to understand complex human entanglements with the natural world, I prioritize new texts that have been overlooked by traditional study. In women's personal comics about depression, I find a visual language that invites a new kind of environmental thinking about the body and its intersection with the material world. In my time today, I'd like to examine the eloquence of women's bodies when on and off depression from medication for depression. I'll focus on only a few moments in the diary comics of Jennifer Crute, Erica Moen, and Allie Brosh, and in Ellen Forney's acclaimed graphic memoir, Marbles. In doing so, I hope to offer a glimpse of the environmental inquiry that disability studies can make possible. This is a developing project, and I want to ask questions that I might not have answers to quite yet, so I invite us to think about these questions together in the context of my talk. I want to ask, what can images of the depressed body communicate to us about complex and varied realities in chemical consumption? What happens when women generate personal histories of depression with their own hands, with their own pencils, ink, or pixels? What happens if we begin to think about access to comprehensive mental health care from a viewpoint of environmental justice? I think that women in these 4 comics navigate the unknowns of prescription medication with the critical resistance of environmental activists navigating chemicals in the broader environment. Crute, Moen, Brosh, and Forney demand the right to define the effects of prescription medication on their own terms. They demand access to medical expertise and the right to challenge such expertise given their own embodied knowledge. They use comics to create an alternative space that critiques a medical discourse of depression that would deny personal history. I understand these comics as products of a chemical era Rachel Carson describes in Silent Spring. Contemporary comics were and still are released to the reading public alongside chemicals produced by military technology, herbicides, fungicides, and pesticides. These chemicals permeate the environments in which we live, down to the very cells of our bodies. Perceptions of these chemicals also permeate the cultural products of our time. The women who write these comics live in a world that is alive to the risks we take when we introduce untested chemical solutions into complex and diverse ecosystems. Bodies in contemporary comics register new and potentially problematic exchanges with environments and chemicals. Women who write about their depression in the midst of these exchanges respond with critical inquiry and creative coalition building. Personal experiences in these comics ultimately determine the value of medicinal treatment. In this first example from Jennifer Crute's Jennifer's Journals from 2005, Crute renders her painful experience with antidepressant medication in one full-page panel. When on these various medications, she's worried that she's destroying her mind. She suffers from dry mouth, as you see on the left-hand side. Meds compromise her productivity at her job, as you can see from her boss saying, "Humph," behind her. She concludes in the bottom right-hand corner here, if you want to see right here, she concludes that meds should be seen as barbaric as shock treatment. She uses the space of this comic to represent her body under the influence of medically permitted drugs. Her comic protests her loss of embodied agency. She encourages her audience to develop an independent assessment of antidepressant medication by asserting their own judgment in defining successful treatment based on how their bodies respond. Erica Moen's online diary comic lyrically meditates on the benefits and disadvantages of medication. Here, the post "Fix Me Up, Buttercup" includes a panel of abstracted hands, hatch-marked, cascading, threatening to suffocate not Erica, but us as well, as they face us as viewers. Erica's face is clear and bright amidst the haze, tilted up, open, hopeful. A stream of pills falls through the air, not yet passing her lips. The caption indicates that Moen is ambivalent about medication. She implores it to fix her up, but knows there's no clear outcome that it can or that it will. Moen offers us a moment of hopeful indecision and contemplative process in this post. The online diary form catches the immediacy of a single day, another attempt to care for herself. We don't see what follows. We're held in this comic within a risk horizon of knowing only about today. Ali Brosh's online comics about her experiences with depression are profoundly and surprisingly popular among thousands of readers. Her website, Hyperbole and a Half, can we see a show of hands of those that have read Hyperbole and a Half? Oh yeah, okay. Her website is, as she says, not really a blog and not really a webcomic either. It's a combination of scripted captions and Microsoft Paint images. Readers generated more than 5,000 individual comments on her long-awaited post about her experiences of depression, and more than 4,000 comments on the subsequent post following it. These most recent installments followed nearly 2 years of silence that deeply worried her audience, as is evident in the call and response relationship she's established in her comment section. In this return to her blog, Brosh draws her body with her signature amateur flair. Her minimalist, candy-colored designs invite readers to see the absurdity of how others respond to her depression. Here, the character Ali responds with her blunt insight to a well-meaning, bright-eyed doctor prescribing her antidepressants. Well, it's all up from here. Look, guy, I don't know what it's like in the I still have meaning in my life land, but every direction looks like bullshit right now. The simplicity of her pink dress and shark tail fin ponytail belie the complexity of her depression and this forceful resistance to medical expertise. Her simplistic body becomes a legible sight upon which readers can understand medical expertise competing with a desire to reclaim meaning in your own life. The final moment I want to share with us today is from Ellen Forney's Marbles. Forney takes us across 4 years of psychiatric therapy and exhausting experimentation with 7 different medications to treat bipolar disorder. Her memoir speculates on the implications of med compliance and creative freedom for women living with chronic depression. I wanted to share this final sequence with you from her memoir because its sudden silence in the midst of a lively and richly inked memoir is haunting. This sequence defines depression as an experience that happens regardless of willpower or resolve. Depression is not something these women can just snap out of, but is a complicated and active condition of their lived reality. Unanchored by verbal text, Ellen's body on this page generates slow, deliberate movement that contradicts stereotypes of people with depression as lazy, delusional, or unfit. While on the prescription of lithium, her body is performing hard labor simply by being present. Existence becomes a kind of labor in and of itself. The contested outcome of pollution in the natural environment serves as an important political backdrop to the indeterminate effects of prescription medication on women living with depression. Forney, Mohn, Brosh, and Crute draw themselves face-to-face with medical experts, studying handfuls of prescribed pills, or lying down, unable to move. Images of medicated and non-medicated women living with depression activate an important critical intersection, that of genetic predisposition, socioeconomic status, access to comprehensive health care, and exposure to environmental hazards and stressors. During sequences in which depression lifts, characters struggle to set up accommodation and support in anticipation of its return. In the unpredictable time between, women use these comics to question the social stigma of seeking treatment and the stigma of defying or resisting medical expertise in favor of one's own embodied knowledge. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for 4 wonderful presentations. Professor Ann Fox has agreed to share a few responses to them before we break for lunch.
Good afternoon. I just have to start by thanking everyone from the University of Oregon for their extraordinary generosity in inviting me to participate today. And watching this panel just reminds me how dazzling I find disability studies. I attended a conference about a month ago in the UK called Avoidance in the Academy, and the whole premise of the conference was, why is the Academy avoiding disability studies. But it strikes me in watching this panel that there is not a lot of avoidance going on, but instead a pleasurable seizing on to the generative quality of disability studies. And so I just have a few comments really about that idea. Rosemary Garland Thompson, who also spoke at that conference, asked a question that has continued to resonate with me for the last few weeks, which is, what do we lose if we lose disability? Which kind of flips the question, because normally disability, we sort of have to push against it being defined as lack. But in hearing each of these presentations, I think about the powerful generative nature of disability and what we would lose if we didn't have those frames. Listening, I'm a disability and theater scholar, and so listening to your presentation was just, I'm so excited. I want to talk to you about so many things. But this idea of the way in which disability can literally make us think outside the box and reframe space. I was thinking about seeing Lisa Bufano perform recently, who unfortunately and very sadly has passed on. And Lisa performed on 4 prosthetic limbs, in which she moved very gracefully and differently through space. And your presentation on those boxes and the reclaiming of space reminded me of how disability makes us step away from how we normally order space, and the play with boundaries about how we occupy space that it can allow. You know, in Lisa's case, it was that boundary between animal and human, and that she took on that kind of animalistic appearance. But in watching those cubes, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm seeing it framed where I normally pass through and being invited to move outside of it. So we would lose that if we didn't have disability thinking. In listening to Michael's presentation, I thought about Oz representationally as a kind of way station in this long history of representation of people of color and of medical apartheid in this country that stretches back to people like J. Marion Sims and forward to Henrietta Lacks. And so Oz and its representation of men of color who are incarcerated reminds us about the ways in which disability has been used to determine citizenship. And that incarceration, of course, still continues for people in nursing homes, people in institutions. And so how are ways in which people of color and disabled people, or people who occupy both spaces, can create that alliance? We would lose that sense of the importance of aligning those identities without disability. I was listening to Lori's presentation and also thinking about how exciting it is that you're working in special education and kind of intervening into a field that often gets vilified within disability studies, right? I was thinking about the power of identities in tandem to liberate each other when you talked about those young people who embrace queerness and disability as mutually constitutive identities. I was thinking about the power of ancestors and mentors when you talked about what mentoring would mean for young queer disabled people, or who claim other gender and sexual identities. Finally, listening to Veronica's presentation, which I listened to especially carefully since I'm teaching marbles on Thursday. Sometimes there's a moment of grace and serendipity when you have a 4,000-mile flight. It's tremendously exciting to me to think about how text and visuals work together to enhance our understanding of disability embodiments. There's such a wide swath now of graphic novels that feature disability: epileptic, marbles, cancer victim. I love that you reminded us that the portrayal of that embodiment very often can most fruitfully be about ambiguity, can most fruitfully be about showing that body where it is in that particular moment, and can be showing the intersection of the social, the physical, the temporal experience of disability, doing things like rewriting our notions of labor. I was very taken with your sentence about there's the hard labor of just existing with depression. And so I loved that idea of the power of the visual and the textual to enhance each other in rewriting narratives and challenging old tropes. So I just want to thank the panelists. It's a great honor to be in your presence and a joy, and it reminds me why I love this work so passionately. So thank you very much.
Hi, I just wanted to say one quick thing before I invite Professor Mel Chen to come up and give a few responses as well. What I wanted to say is that one of the really amazing things about disability studies at the University of Oregon is that one of the well springs of it is in special education. And we have very strong work here with Deborah Olson and Heidi von Ravensburg and the rest of the College of Education in supporting disability studies. And I think we have, there's a wonderful potential to work together across disciplines and fields here. And now I'll ask Mel Chen to come up and say a few words.
Hello, everyone. I just want to repeat what Anne said, that it's such a tremendous honor to be here, and that somehow I thought we were going to all be in a living room in couches sitting next to each other, so I'll just imagine that we're in a living room. I just had a few things to add from my own perspective about these 4 fantastic talks, and I love the prompt to speak informally, because I think a lot of things can sort of pop up that way. And a lot of thoughts were popping up for me about all of these papers that had to do with this sort of sense that all of your work constitutes the cutting edge of disability studies. And while I don't always love this idea that there's always a new idea that kind of, gets the credit, I do think that you're all taking part in a series of movements that are very important and very much welcome within disability studies. So for example, Lori and Michael both point out the problems with additive models of intersectionality, which presume that you can talk about race without thinking simultaneously about gender, sexuality, class, age, and nationhood, and more. And I think implicitly, especially in Lori's piece, they point out the importance of attending, sorry, my scribbles are very, very hard to read. The importance of attending to the inevitably greater richness of lives that are lived at those intersections, right? Rather than sort of applying some formula, like racial minorities must be class minorities as well. The lives lived at those intersections, I think, are always richer than what we might predict from an alienated point of view. And I think also there's a feeling in a lot of disability studies work that I'm so affected by, and it has to do with an urgent wish for disabled people and others to be self-determining. And I felt the energy of self-determination in all of these papers. I think the kind of the richness of analysis is also evident in Francis's approach to, I guess I'm not trained in your field at all, but I guess when I think about a term that I might use as sort of an environmental architecture, the idea of beating paths with our bodies is beautiful, and in some ways privileges the way that, again, this ideal of self-determination, especially in a context that is full of, let's say, rigidly built, unpermitting, permanent built environments. And then Veronica's work, I'm just delighted to see, took for granted the importance of illness studies within disability studies. And now, having been in disability studies for a while, I just got a sense of these internal debates, and some of them are very painful to witness. But one of them is that illness is a more recent it's understood as a kind of proper topic for disability studies only more recently. So I'm really thrilled to see you not only taking that up, but also considering it in the context of graphic arts. So, so thank you all so much. This is the best I could do. Anne, you're so much better at this than me.
So it's now my great pleasure to introduce our 2 speakers for this afternoon, and I'm going to introduce both of them. First is Dr. Anne Fox, who earned her master's and PhD in English at Indiana University Bloomington and is a professor of English at Davidson College in Davidson, North Carolina. She specializes in modern and contemporary dramatic literature and disability studies. She teaches a freshman writing course on disability studies and regularly teaches classes about disability in drama and literature. Her scholarship on disability and theater has been supported by an AAUW postdoctoral fellowship and is published in Legacy Contemporary Theater Review, the National Women's Studies Association Journal, Gendering Disability, the Journal of Literary and Cultural Disability Studies, and the Disability Studies Quarterly. She has served on the executive board of the Society for Disability Studies and the MLA Executive Committee on the Division of Disability Studies, and her current book project traces the representation of disability on the 20th century commercial stage. Our other speaker this afternoon is Mel Chen, who is an associate professor of gender and women's studies and director of the Center for Study of Sexual Cultures at UC Berkeley, and is an affiliate of the Haas Disability Studies and LGBTQ Citizenship Research Clusters, Berkeley Center for Race and Gender, and the Center for Science, Technology, Medicine, and Society. Mel's recent book, Animacies, explores questions of racializing queering disability and effective economies in animate and inanimate life. Recently, Mel contributed an article on civic membership, protest ableism, and the racialization of embodiment to a special issue of Amerasia devoted to Asian American disability studies. Mel began a 3-year term on the board of directors of the Society for Disability Studies in June of this year. So please join me in welcoming our two speakers.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. And again, I want to extend my profound thanks to Betsy Wheeler and everyone here at the University of Oregon who has been so welcoming. These kinds of visits seemed, we come into this room and eat this wonderful food and it's all very effortless, but there's about 1 million emails behind every decision. And so I'm very aware of the labor that goes into this. So thank you, Betsy, and thank you everyone at U of O. I also have to say, I often say a couple of things before I give talks. I used to be a nervous flyer, so I always would love when the pilot would say it's 1 hour and 27 minutes to Albuquerque, because then I would watch my watch. And so Wheels Up to Wheels Down, this is about a 15-minute talk. So, if you want to tune me out for a while, that's cool, or if you get tired, whatevs, it's about 15 minutes. Also, bodies matter, so please, if you want to get up and get dessert, move around, go to the bathroom, whatever, this is a space where bodies can move around and do what they need to do. I'm so pleased to be part of this forum. I'm so honored. It reminds me of when I first came on the bus of disability studies, and the esprit de corps that is part of this field continues to captivate me. And so I'm particularly grateful to be in this space where we can talk about why disability studies matters. And that's the sort of through line of my talk today. It's not a particularly theoretical one. I don't know how even scholarly it is, but Betsy asked me to talk about my journey through disability studies and how it's reinvigorated my work and why I love doing it. And so my talk is Reinventing Our Bodies of Work Through Disability, from the page to the gallery in the classroom. One of my favorite works of theater is the second play in Angels in America called Perestroika, and at the end of that play, the character who has suffered through AIDS and the ravages of that illness says, "I bless you, more life, the great work begins." And I think there's that sense of disability studies being a great work that is ongoing, and one that I'm very privileged to be part of. I'm an English professor who has worked in the field of disability studies for about 12 years. What is someone who wrote her dissertation on female playwrights writing for the Broadway stage doing in disability studies? What is someone who is non-disabled, and I will disclose my status, doing in disability studies? And to paraphrase the Janet Jackson song, what has disability studies done for me lately? Well, one of the things that disability studies has made me aware of are hidden histories and alternate histories. So I could tell this history in a couple of different ways. I could speak in a very linear fashion, reinforcing the normate, telling you of the official academic markers, the transformative experience of my participation in the National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Institute on Disability Studies in 2000, from which time disability studies has been a very natural outgrowth and complement to my feminist studies of theater. But I have to tell you the hidden history of that summer too. My own position as a person new to the field, welcomed warmly by scholars like Paul Longmore and Rosemarie Garland Thompson, whose get on board the bus sensibility still permeates disability studies today. I won't deny that there are debates, that we disagree with each other in the field, but we're also keenly aware of how much we need each other and how much the world needs this emphasis we bring on valuing more kinds of embodiment. And I've never been in an academic field more welcoming. Disability made sense to me as an identity as soon as I thought of it that way. As someone who at the time lived in a more excessive body, I used to weigh a lot more, and as someone who sort of moved in that body through the world, understood what it was like for that body to be marked and defined as problematic, even though I didn't claim the label of disability. Disability made sense to me as someone who studied feminist theater and already understood that what it had to say about the construction of normalcy and pushing it back against strictures leveled against bodies of all kinds. Let me draw on the personal archive for a moment. As I was working on this talk last week, I unearthed the cover letter I wrote for tenure in 2005. So young. But I think some of the things I thought that disability, that I said in that letter at the time that disability had to teach, still ring true for me, and I want to share them with you, just kind of as reminders. These are things a lot of us already know, but I was sort of struck in reminding myself, why do we do this? Well, we do it because disability is a culture with its own attendant history, civil rights movement, its own artistic and cultural tradition. We do it because society's insistence on normalcy reinforces disturbing assumptions about who should and should not inhabit the world based on their relation to socially constructed ideals of beauty, of movement, of personhood, of citizenship. We do it because a disability studies perspective can encourage us to reevaluate the construction of these ideals, and in so doing, imagine there are ways of being and doing in the world and in art that can move us beyond what we had previously assumed to be set and natural. We do it in literary study because disability studies can help us re-see traditional works in important ways, to reread the presence and potential of the disruptive disabled body. We do it in theater, which is my field, because disability studies offers the chance to reinterpret the symbolic uses of the disabled body in performance. It enables us to imagine new possibilities for meaning and movement on stage through the adoption of a disability aesthetic, and I think we saw that very powerfully in the first presentation on the plenary this morning. What results is not mere tolerance, is not mere acceptance of difference, but disability's power to fire the imagination. What would we lose if we lost disability? Let me tell you another part of this history, another way into disability for me. I really came to disability in 1996 when, as an adjunct lecturer in performing arts in Washington University in St. Louis, I found my way to this field through the arts. A colleague of mine was creating community-based theater, and this is a slide of that theater company, the Disability Project. And she was kind of a bossy playwright friend, as many playwright friends are. And she said, "You need to come work with me on my project." And I went, okay. And I went to these weekly sessions at the Washington University School of Occupational Therapy, which was the only place that had enough disability parking in St. Louis, right? So here we are in the space of that OT school making work about disability, about sex, about love, about employment, about stigma. I hadn't realized what I was getting myself into. Had I never hung out with disabled people before? Had I never heard them joke and write and share stories about their lives? I hadn't, but I did now. And awestruck, I listened to story after story interrogate what I thought I knew about the body. I'll say more about that in a second. Disability as an identity immediately made sense, as well as its work to imagine new representations in culture. What I later came to understand as disability aesthetics fired my imagination. It presented new ways of conceptualizing the body politic, the body of our historical knowledge, the body of art and literature, whose bodies are invited into public through how space is configured, and of course, our own messy, imperfect, lovable material bodies. And so disability, right now in my work, disability aesthetics are at the heart of this. We can flip that old binary for good or for ill. Here, for ill is for good. And such disability thinking has helped me reinvent my body of work, my writing, my curating, and my teaching. So let me talk to you about those three areas very briefly. So the history of where it went from there. For me as a drama scholar, disability compelled me to ask, how has the stage been a place where disabled bodies can intervene into their own representation? In my own writing, I've reappropriated the title metaphor from a 1938 play by George S. Kaufman and Moss Hart. It was called The Fabulous Invalid. And in it, they imagined theater to be this sick and always on the brink of expiring invalid. There's literally an invalid on stage that's theater, kind of dying, but not dying. And I love that title because I thought, for me, that title really symbolized the presence of disability in theater over time as a fabulous invalid, a kind of queer concept of fabulosity. I see the fabulosity in the disability, not despite it. The extraordinary body on stage as disruptive, subversive, and a challenge to preset ideas about normalcy. So that's my book project. It's called The Fabulous Invalid, Disability on Stage from Melodrama to Mid-Century. What's been most interesting to me are the ways in which this subversion happens that aren't always immediately obvious or haven't been read as such. So I've traced a lot of different theatrical conversations of this kind. How, for example, did Tennessee Williams intersect the oppression of queerness and disability in his plays? Why does it matter to understand how Edward Albee helps counter eugenic thinking in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? What does it mean to understand disability in a global context through theater? As I asked when I was looking at the representation of vaginal fistula in Lynn Nottage's play Ruined, which is about wartime rape in the Congo. And more recently, I've been fascinated with even sort of reclaiming depictions of disability in theater that we've kind of held at arm's length for a while. So I'm currently writing about Laura Wingfield in The Glass Menagerie. And poor Laura Wingfield is often seen as myth disability. You know, it's this sort of this fragile, fragmented character that we sort of reject. And yet I think in re-examining the play, I've been fascinated to see how really the social construction of disability and her internalized ableism is powerfully performed by Williams. And another piece I'm writing on right now is the representation of disability and mental illness in the American musical. And so I'm looking at Next to Normal alongside The Light in the Piazza and how mental illness and intellectual disability are performed in these very popular pieces. Loving performance has led me to visual culture. And so in 2009, I co-curated 2 shows with Jessica Cooley, who's currently a PhD student in art history and disability studies at Wisconsin. And the first show we curated was called Reformations, Disability, Women in Sculpture, that looked at the intersecting experience of disability and female identity and how it could be presented through sculpture, a form that's traditionally associated with masculinity, ample financial resources, and physical virtuosity. The other show was entitled Staring, and is based on Rosemary Garland Thompson's book of the same title that explored the power for visual activism inherent in disability through art. In both exhibitions, disability compelled questions including, how can we understand disability as a multifaceted identity? How can we see disability as an integral part of the art-making process, not something art is made in spite of? How can the social and physical experiences of disability be embodied in art? How can hierarchies of disability be questioned? What defines disability culture in the visual? And so the work we curated lent itself to very particular kinds of questions. So you see this slide of the Seattle-based artist Harriet Sanderson's, this is a shoe from an installation piece she created for us called Molt with Skurs. And this shoe is heeled with a cane handle, right? I don't know if you can kind of tell that from where you are. And so how does putting that cane handle on this high-heeled shoe rewrite the medical device as disability sexy, as crip couture, as disability cool, even as it speaks to the instability that the artist sometimes feels living in her own post-polio body? And I would add, any woman who's teetered on heels taller than an inch can sometimes feel. How does Nancy Fried torso with hands on hips, or the flirt, reject the idealized female form in classical sculpture, showing instead the experience of a post-mastectomy body, here flirty and sexual rather than commodified and pinkified? How does Chris Rush's Conti crayon drawing The Accomplice, which prominently features a white space that is otherwise taboo in portraiture, use that space to at once recall those with intellectual disabilities who are not here, perhaps dead, perhaps warehoused in institutions, and invite us to step into it, becoming the accomplices of the men pictured in fellow citizenship and advocacy. How does disability stare back? Here we see a portrait called Shayla, painted by Doug Auld, who worked with young burn survivors in New Jersey. And this is another Chris Rush piece on the left, paired with a Rembrandt drawing. And the Chris Rush piece, called Paper Crown, very tenderly depicts a baby who has a limb difference. And in that image, his limb difference is made part of who he is, visualized, but part of the very tender image of this child, as opposed to Rembrandt's drawing, which is drawn from the Davidson collection, in which it's called Crab Hands, and the man who's pictured actually has a hand difference, but it's covered by the fulminating lace cuffs that to sort of mask disability. And we put those images side by side to sort of, contrast invisibility in history with new visibility through art. In my own classroom, I've worked with a microbiologist. I currently teach a class called Representations of HIV/AIDS with a professor named Dave Wessner. And in that class, we talk about the representation of illness across science and the humanities. And so this is an image we like to show very often when we give our talks on the class. One of the constructs we talk about is patient zero. And so in the lower right-hand corner, you see a kind of illness map or disease map, right? And patient zero is that red circle in the middle. And we talk about the epidemiological necessity for that construction, but we put that in dialogue with the very problematic and insidious ways in which patient zero has been used as a construct to vilify others. Most prominently in AIDS history and The Band Played On, when Randy Schultz sort of identifies Gaetan Dugas, the French-Canadian airline steward who supposedly brought HIV/AIDS to North America, and kind of feeds homophobia in his depiction and feeds xenophobia in his depiction. So that's a way in which disability studies has kind of invigorated my classroom working with a scientist, which is a really cool kind of cross-disciplinary way in which disability studies has had reach for me. This is an image from Reformations. It's a doily made by the fiber artist Laura Splon, and it's the viral structure of HIV/AIDS depicted in a doily. And so it's a really wonderful way that art can call attention to the social construction of illness. Until you see this doily, you just think, oh, until you know what this doily is, you think, oh, what a pretty doily, the domestic, lovely. I often ask my students, do you even know what doilies are? But enough of them do. Yeah. And then, yeah, exactly, their grandmother's houses or my parents' house. What's interesting to me is how this representation of HIV/AIDS also calls attention to the ways in which this metaphor for the domestic kind of calls our attention to our fears of infection, the ways in which fears of infecting the home, the homeland, have been used to justify oppressing and pushing away people with illness. And so how can art, this has been a really powerful question for me in my curating and classroom work, how can art speak to that social experience across disciplinary lines, across genres, across media, right? Just really to sort of conclude, I just want to share with you a couple things I've done. In my disability and literature class, students have engaged disability in the space of the museum in multiple ways. They created proposals to make our local art museum more accessible, and I don't mean add more ramps. They designed modules that would make the work of the museum more accessible to people with intellectual disabilities. So we really think about access as a philosophical construct and not just a physical one, although the physical is important. We traveled to the Smithsonian, and the person on the right, some of you may know, is Catherine Ott, who's a medical historian, and she showed my students artifacts of disability at the Smithsonian Museum, and that sort of engagement with the material history of disability has been really invigorating and important for my classroom. It led to some really interesting discussions. They went out into different museums into Washington, D.C., and started to ask where would there be disability aesthetics. And one of the most poignant transformations for me was a student who went from saying, well, why don't we do those simulation exercises in this class, Dr. Fox, right? You know, and I gave her the whole shtick about how problematic they are. And, you know, it comes from a genuine place of empathy, but you want to say, look, this isn't real. This is not helping. And so this student, through engaging with disability history, disability aesthetics, went from saying, oh, I wish we'd do those exercises, to this was an installation by Barbara Kruger at the Hirshhorn If you know Barbara Kruger's work, she's a feminist artist who works in text, and there's huge blocks of text blown up. Whose power, whose body, whose beliefs. And the student came back very excited after having seen this Barbara Kruger installation and said, "This was disability aesthetics." And I'm like, "Why?" And she said, "Because it made me see my reading differently, because it made me aware of my body looking at this text, asking questions about power, and it blew me away." So all of a sudden, it wasn't just about whether I have the goggles on that have, the light blocked, but it became about trying to understand how artwork was getting me to see a different embodiment philosophically, if not literally. The point, she argued, was not to simulate reading difference, but to mark the ways in which so-called normal bodies experience space and ask what happens when we're removed from how our own normalcy might be privileged. So I want to close by putting the question to you all. What are the ways in which you have and can make disability invigorate your own bodies of work? I wish I could stay here because I can only imagine the exciting ways in which I know disability will continue to interrogate and invigorate on the U of O campus what all of us think we know before we entered this room about what was set, what was natural, what was normal, about our own bodies of work, about to be radically and compellingly reconceptualized through disability culture and disability studies. Thank you.
Okay, I will get started. Thank you so much to especially Betsy, but all the organizers who put so much effort into organizing this fantastic, huge living room symposium. And thank you to everyone who has spoken today, which made my job easier. And I have two images that are really just sitting in my mind and which I'll take home. One is Michael's beautiful bow tie, and the other is Anne's image of the fulminating lace cuffs. Just so gorgeous. So I'm very, very grateful to be here, and Betsy's invitation to speak informally rubs up a little bit against my neoliberal wish to give you your time and money's worth. And yet, Anne and Betsy and I were talking about what would it mean if instead of our talks we had a crip dance instead. And one of the wonderful features of many disability studies conferences is that the end of it is what everyone really comes for, and it's a dance for everyone, and it's a place where people, especially who are visibly disabled, cannot feel like freaks, and it is a space of discovery for everyone. Because people are dancing on the floor, horizontally, using different kinds of movement that we don't normally see in kind of like clubhouse sort of dance spaces. So at least I'll just leave you with that feeling as I speak. So I think half of my talk will be informal because I was inspired by Anne's just momentary comment to me earlier that she was going to say a little bit about why she does disability studies, and that's a story I'm always happy to tell myself. And I'm later this week going to a Disability and Disclosure in Higher Education conference, which is precisely about these kinds of questions of disclosure. And it was interesting that you felt you needed to disclose that you weren't disabled, and what these politics are that affect all of us who are thinking about doing disability studies, and the questions are not easy to answer, So I started out as a computer engineering student. I was fascinated by, I don't know, like utopias of perfect computer design, and I was trying to design microprocessors that had really good pipelining, but my research focus in graduate school was fault tolerance, and that was about kind of having parallel processes that catch errors and correct them on the fly. So looking back, which I did a couple years ago, it was so ironic to think that I was specializing in fault tolerance, because that sounds a lot like neoliberalism today, which is a kind of soft approach to people with disabilities, to racial minorities, to welfare recipients, while being really hard-assed, in fact, right? Being very racist, breaking down the welfare state in the interest of more money going to the few property owners who are left. So, so I fled from computer engineering in part because I was concerned about this templatic human who was supposed to be interacting with the computers, and there was something disturbing to me about it. There was a kind of cognitive normativity imagined to be interfacing with the computers, and I just was not happy with it. So I went into linguistics, which was my second love, in part because I had so much trouble with language. And so as a young person, I had a lot of auditory problems processing people's speech and had to develop some very kind of associative strategies for figuring out what people were saying. And I also had a lot of trouble reading, so I got C's in history because I couldn't get past the first paragraph. Within linguistics, I was exposed to this concept of animacy. And animacy, A-N-I-M-A-C-Y, is has been most extensively studied within linguistics. And it was introduced by a linguist named Michael Silverstein. And he was interested in looking cross-linguistically, that is at many different language families, including indigenous ones. And what he noticed was that there were hierarchies of sentience, of agency, of mobility that seemed to be operating in language. So I'll, again, just to make this the living room that I want it to be, I'm going to just say a few sentences and you let me know if anything feels funny. The mice that cats eat. The wheelchairs that people use. The hikers that rocks crush. Darn it, you were supposed to. Oh, shoot. Oh, no. Okay, my best moment. And so the hikers that rocks crush feels funny in part because it quietly violates this expectation of relative agency between the rocks and the hikers. The hikers are supposed to be perpetrating some kind of action on the rocks. Rocks shouldn't be imaginably doing something to hikers. And so there's a rule within English about relative clauses. You English professors know this better than I. That gets violated in a sentence like the hikers that rocks crush. So the presumption then, since this happens in fact in every documented language around the world, is it's deeply grammatical, which is to say that it's sort of almost unconscious, right? We are all coerced into keeping track of what has more agency, what has more sentience, what has more mobility, and we need to be able to sort of spit that back out linguistically because our grammar has to reflect it. So there's something coercive not only about language, as any immigrant will tell you, but also about the orders of matter that we live with. And within that hierarchy, on average, and this is sort of a kind of holistic perspective, men tend to be on the top, women tend to be below them, disabled people tend to be below them, and then we have animals, and then we have plants, and then we have minerals like stones. So there's something deeply meaningful then, right? If I ask you, well, is stuff disabled? Is this podium, this elegant, prestigious podium, is it disabled? Well, what about if I said, you know, the expression dumb as a box of rocks? Well, the presumption within this sentence is that actually rocks are dumb, right? And we're using that knowledge referentially to depict humans. So my general contention is that not only must we keep track of and note the ways, right, in which disabled people and other folks who have been mapped at places below the top of that hierarchy, how they resist and shift those hierarchies. We need to keep track of those ways because precisely so many human groups are imagined as unanimated or strangely animated or lacking certain kinds of sentience, right? And this is the same logic as Sonora Taylor would tell us that rationalizes the treatment of animals. In other words, that they lack certain kinds of sentience and therefore we are entitled to treat them in various ways. So Sonora Taylor's claim, which I very much appreciate, is that both disabled humans and non-human animals are subject to very similar logics, and I would say precisely because of these kinds of hierarchies of animacy. And so we might be remiss to think that we should just only talk about humans. Why not also map the ways that the stuff around us informs how we think about different kinds of humans, how difference gets mapped across both matter and human bodies. I'm also thinking about the case of Terry Schiavo, who, does everyone remember this case? She experienced a pretty catastrophic bodily breakdown and fell into a coma, and then her family fought with, her husband fought with her parents over whether she should be allowed to die. So this highlighted a very public discussion of disability in the States about what lives are worth living, essentially. And Leonard Davis has said about her case that had language been used other than persistent vegetative state, then she might have been treated differently. So again, even with a term like persistent vegetative state, we are learning not only about the kind of sentient capacity of a specific human individual, but we're also learning about how non-sentient vegetables are. And there is a lot of new research out there that is talking about how various plants, crustaceans and other things seem to experience pain or seem to have behavioral patterns that suggest some kind of experience like pain. So this question of life and death has been very important in my own research and makes me think twice about questions of euthanasia rights, for example. And I had a conversation with Eli Clare, who's a poet and disability theorist, and he said it's just, I'm not going to promote euthanasia as a legal right until the social disabling of disabled people has been corrected, right? This is the goal we should set before we get to matters of mercy killing and euthanasia. And I want to say one other thing about animacy, which is that so both indigenous languages and what we might call colonial languages, or at least Western-dominated languages that are more closely linked to Judeo-Christian systems of belief and great chain of being kinds of logics, both sets of languages seem to exhibit this kind of animacy hierarchy. But what I'm trying to think about now is the different qualities of those hierarchies. So I think within a kind of colonial animacy model, we end up seeing things like what Michael called a colonial gender system, which is a very, very severe imagination of different kinds of capacities, different kinds of rights within a kind of Western imagining of matter. And I think on some level it's clear that various indigenous approaches to the world around them are not beholden to the same kinds of radical methods of control that Western logics have been. Okay, so hence the book Animacies, in which I extended the linguistic model to think about other forms of hierarchalization of matter. And around this time, I got very sick as a result of a combination of things, one of which was heavy metal toxicity, and so that sort of foretold my, next deeper interest. And I'm still sick. So everything I'm thinking about in illness studies, for example, is the question of thresholds. So I'm down 2 or 3 days a week, and then when I'm up, I'm up. So I'm kind of a lurking sick person. And so what does that mean about my status as a disabled person? I'm still reluctant to claim disability precisely because I have a tremendous respect for the kinds of models of disability that have come before me, and I'm not sure I need to claim it. At the same time, I do allow others to claim me as disabled because there are other ways in which it actually definitively counts as disability. But I guess I'm trying to illustrate maybe why I pointed out Veronica's talk as an example of this kind of cutting edge of just taking for granted that illness should be included in disability studies. And for me, the question of illness also becomes one of temporality. So within disability studies, there's this notion of crip time, which is a way of describing how disabled people exist in time in ways that just don't quite reflect the normative expectations of living in time for non-disabled people. And for chronic illness, you get this sort of periodic, this sort of periodic incidental radical debility combined with other periods of ability. So I think the question of time is a very deep one. Extending that question, I was recently in a conference in Prague called Decolonizing Disability, Cripping Development. And so I'm very interested in thinking about the two meanings of development, right? We have human development, and we have this sort of notion of developmental disability, which is very much taken up within disability studies and elsewhere, including also in education, both special education and disability studies in education. And then we also have economic development, right? So we have the terms that we tend to use pretty smoothly. We have the developed countries and we have the undeveloped countries. Do those have anything to do with each other? Perhaps, if we think about the ways that modernity, especially modernity informed by histories of colonialism and kind of resource mining by certain sites around the world, by other privileged sites, we get this sense of retardation of development, that some countries are permanently indebted and permanently retarded, right? And also are subject to terms like primitive as opposed to modern. So one recent example was the case of this very complicated case of a Roma child who seemed to be phenotypically Caucasian and essentially was sort of racially profiled, and they did DNA tests on her parents, and there's a huge hullabaloo about her provenance, whether she was stolen from a different family. And within this conference, Cripping Development in Prague, there was a lot of discussion about Roma people. They're essentially disabled by the existing systems that view them as kind of parasitic on normal society. So we get a New York Times article that non-ironically asks, are the Roma primitive or just poor? Ugh. But just to say that I think in terms of temporality, right, there's a certain ease with describing certain cultures as traditional, even here in the United States, in part because of our history of immigration and the ways that that became interlaced with racist ideas derived from colonialism about the primitive and the modern. So what am I doing? I'm interested in looking at maybe things that don't immediately look like disability, but which are somehow in the same terrain as things that look like disability. And so I think I'll give you the sort of more formal, or at least more written part of my paper now in relation to the question of contemporary Asian depictions in relation to a history of Down syndrome being understood as Mongoloidism. Is everyone hearing me okay? Okay. So in 1866, oh, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back a bit. Wait. Okay. In 1866, Langdon Down, an English researcher and clinician, depicted what appears to be the same as what is today referred to as Down syndrome. But he depicted it, he referred to it as mongoloid idiot or imbecile. So he described what he perceived as evolutionarily atavistic alterations of a otherwise European descended child. And he wrote, I quote, "The great Mongolian family has numerous representatives, and it is to this division I wish in this paper to call special attention. A very large number of congenital idiots are typical Mongols," and he had a series of 5 major racial groups around the world that he characterized in terms of specific kinds of developmental disabilities, which is sort of like science fiction to me, looking back, but it was well suited in terms of the kinds of evolutionary discourses that were going on in England at the time. So marked is this, that when placed side by side, it is difficult to believe that the specimens compared are not children of the same parents. The hair is not black, as is the real Mongol, but of a brownish color, straight and scanty. The face is flat and broad and destitute of prominence. That's one way to say it. The cheeks are roundish and extended laterally. Later he spoke of the slight dirty yellowish tinge of the skin. Due to the regularity of the features and the difficulty of realizing that that child is the child of Europeans, Down writes that there can be, quote, "no doubt that these ethnic features are the result of evolutionary degeneration." When do these terms, human development and economic development, and their notional kin appear in the official books of medical references or economic programs? When do such notions become animated in lateral, less easily detectable, and yet archaeologically tempting ways? So the story goes about Mongoloidism, that Langdon Down was misled and has since been disproven. And the other ethnic stereotypes besides Mongoloidism justifiably fell by the wayside. But besides his strongest attention to Mongolian idiots in that paper, a more haunting question for me is something like, why is Mongoloidism the one that stuck? Why did these other fascinating types fall out? Was it simply convincing? What has survived of intuitive racisms that depict Asians with what has been described as less body hair, more facial flatness, and more as neotenous, more like white children, say, before they develop more body hair? Can we really help Asians by advising that they eat less soy to prevent such neoteny and depressed reproductive capacity? I'm speaking a little mockingly here. But there are textures of these kinds of discussions within mainstream discourse about Asians. And yet I'm hesitant to strive for certain difference between modern day Asians and the so-called Mongolian idiots of Langdon Down's time. Chris Borthwick, who wrote about the early racialization of Mongoloids, Mongoloidism, or Downs, writes, the analogy between Mongolian idiots and Mongolians was insulting to Mongolians, and I think he also means Asians, and contributed to their dismissive treatment by Westerners in the colonial era. Analogies, however, point in two directions. If it was insulting to compare Mongolians to people with impaired functioning, it was also insulting to compare people with a disability to the Victorian stereotype of an uncreative, limited, passive race that had seized its development before the British. Both groups were seen as developmentally delayed. But his confidence about the separability of these groups, I think for me, makes a deeper alliance seem unthinkable. And that's where I want to be provocatively pushing the possibilities of alliance while still being very, very careful, right, about the relative privileges of various groups. But I think one kind of perspective that I would really love to pay more attention to is the co-formation of certain notions of disability and certain notions of race. So I've been thinking a lot about eyes lately. And of course, one of the prominent features for Downs was this sort of presence of the epicanthic fold, which I think is sort of like here. I'm not exactly sure. I think it's something sort of around the way the sort of top eyelid meets the bottom eyelid. And when he identified the presence of the epicanthic fold in these apparently European children, he identified them, therefore, as having Mongol features. And so here's where I'm kind of doing a few provocative ventures. And I want to think through some moments that really don't look like disability and arguably aren't disability. But again, there's this question of shared provenance that I want to think about. So, and I'm turning to kind of pop culture and mainstream media here. So Julie Chen is a news anchor. And there's been recently, sort of surprisingly, again, discussion of this epicanthic fold. Oops.
Is 25 years.
I'm just going to share with you. She's on a female talk show of kind of multiracial women who discuss all kinds of topics, and here she's kind of revealing her own history in relation to her own epicanthic fold. Wait, darn it.
Is 25 years old, and I was working as a local news reporter in Dayton, Ohio. Now, I want to set the scene for you guys, so I want to show you footage of what a young Julie Chen looked like in 1995 in Dayton.
Julie Chen is live in Moraine with more on this. Julie?
Well, Mark, as odd as it may sound, the reason that the OSP temporarily stopped using breathalyzers was because the problem was in the solution.
Now, all right. You know, it's cold out in the field. I wanted to try and get a seat on the anchor desk. So I asked my news director, I said, you know, if holidays, anchors want to take vacations, you know, could I fill in? Like, I don't care, I'll work Christmas. And he said, you will never be on this anchor desk because you're Chinese. And I was like, and he said, let's face it, Julie, how relatable are you to our community? How big of an Asian community do we really have in Dayton? The audience can't relate to you because you're not like them. Wow. And he said, on top of that, because of your heritage, because of your Asian eyes, sometimes I've noticed when you're on camera and you're interviewing someone, you look disinterested. and all I could see was my eyes. And does he have a point? And I mean, you can see in like some of my interviews, like I'm listening to, like in this one, I'm listening to this sheriff's deputy talk, and all I'm looking at is my eyes, like, do I look bored or disinterested in what my subject is telling me? So fast forward, I'm like, I gotta get another job if I can. I can't work for this guy. So I start meeting with agents for career advice, so on and so forth. And this one big time agent.
So I'm sorry, I'm going to just cut it off there because she goes on, but she goes on to sort of say, in this complicated way, now, yeah, that was racism, but now I look more alert, I look more, and then Cheryl Underwood, her co-host, says, more expressive? And she nods, and essentially her co-host has mirrored what the bosses said. And then Cheryl Underwood goes on to say, you made a choice that was just for you, and you have represented, I'm going to say it, your people, you have represented your race and your colleagues. You should be proud of yourself. Don't look back. And then, you know, this is from like a month ago in the student paper of the Daily Cal, which is UC Berkeley's newspaper, and you will find ads for what's called Asian eyelid surgery, and there are protests about these ads now. Okay, so this question of kind of social problems, inexpressibility. We're talking about sort of old stereotypes of inscrutability, but what do those stereotypes have to do with histories of disability? I don't think there's no connection, and the question is how to plumb that connection. So the other part of my research is looking at, or that I'm sharing with you today, is looking at Orange is the New Black. I thought I'd just pop out some of the popular stuff. How many people have seen this hit show? Okay. So there's a lot of queerness in there. There's a lot of multiracial alliances. Some of that is just so beautiful to witness because we don't get to see much of it on TV. And I was really enjoying it, and I saw, wow, there's even an Asian person in there. And yet, after watching it for a while, I just sort of, my heart broke a little bit. So what's maybe less noticed about Orange is the New Black is that disability is a major theme in the show. Nearly every major character has some kind of relationship to disability. So there's a woman who does not speak, although at one moment she breaks out into song, which is a popular trope, I guess. I was disappointed. There's another person who is addicted to meth, and there are discussions about whether that counts as disability or not, but there are these things that are very proximate to disability. And my larger analysis has to do with this question of indebtedness, both transnationally or internationally, and also within the United States. There are countries and also people who are depicted as properly indebted or like acceptably indebted. So that's like what a mortgage might be if you can afford it. And there are other people who are imagined as fatally indebted. And I describe the prison as one of those places that houses the fatally indebted. They're both morally indebted because they need to be corrected, and they're financially indebted because they tend to be the much poorer and more racialized population from within the states. So the coincidence of indebtedness and disability, I think, is not just circumstance. So in one of the critical scenes in the show, Chang has been elected to a representative position in the sort of micro-government thing they have set up. And it's a racialized micro-government. So there's someone who represents the white people, there's someone who represents the Latinas, there's someone who represents the Asians and the others. And I actually don't see anyone else who's Asian, and I'm not sure what other would mean in this context. So Chang represents Chang, but Chang did get elected, by Chang, I guess. And we see in the first meeting in which the representatives put their claims on the table to the warden, this is what we need. I need good pillows. I need access to 50 Shades of Grey. It's Chang's term. And I'll just show you. No, I feel like I'm running out of time. So I'll just tell you that it's Chang's turn to represent. And Chang says, okay, and sits there and then falls asleep. And so there's interesting things here that go on around the uses of Chang's eyes and the kinds of claims to citizenship that are being expressed through this narration of Asian representation. So this was the scene that sort of broke my heart because it sort of seemed to reflect a very kind of old notion about Asian citizenship, but articulated in new ways. And so then we can ask what kind of disability is being sort of discussed here. And I think it's a very complex one, but I guess I'm really interested in finding new ways to refer to disabilization while again respecting the kinds of disabilities that are readable and nameable and governable, I guess. Okay, so the final gesture is a discussion of the shape of the eye, which is essentially counts as a disability memoir by the poet George Estreich, whose biological mother is a Japanese war survivor. And he has a daughter with Downs, and he basically refuses to let this mutuality go. And essentially he says, okay, my daughter, people say she has Asian eyes. Is that because she has Downs, or is it because she has a Japanese grandmother? And his book just never lets this go. It doesn't refuse one or the other. It doesn't correct it. And essentially by the end of the book, in kind of this characteristic way within disability memoir of resisting a little bit of this over-medicalization, he doesn't settle any of the stories. And I think his novel then, or his memoir, depicts precisely what I'm trying to work at in this juncture between primitivity, modernity, race, and disability. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you so much for your time.
I hope this is still on. Thank you so much, both of you. Wonderful, thought-provoking, stimulating, all those wonderful adjectives. We have a few minutes for questions and comments, and I'd like to open it up. If you have questions for either Anne or Mel, please, this is our time.
I just want to apologize. I feel like I took too much time and I forgot to notice when I started. I'm really, really sorry.
No. Absolutely, no. Okay.
Hi, Mel. I thought I would just throw in there, what do you make of the fact that I subscribe to Entertainment Weekly as, one of my scholarly sources, and I'm not kidding. And they usually refer to Julie Chen in Entertainment Weekly as the Chen bot. So I thought I'd just throw that into the mix.
I think that there's some. Yeah, I think that there are some interesting relationships to explore between other forms of disability that are read as social, but I think within disability studies we can contest that, but autism is one of them, right? And this kind of, the sort of flat expression, it's complicated. I think these languages, for me, just raise the relevance of thinking about animacy as this very broad kind of cosmology that just informs these kinds of depictions in much richer ways than perhaps we're willing to notice. Yeah, thank you.
I'm told this one is wireless. Can I walk this back to you so we're sure that it's captured on the video. Oh, you know, I should say that this is being videotaped, and the link will be on the USAID site soon, one of these days.
So, Mel, I also, actually, self-conscious standing up. Actually just saw that episode of Orange is the New Black last night. What's fascinating about it is the Chang character doesn't really show up much until that episode. And she's the representative of she's the only non-racial representative there. So it's the blacks, the whites, the Latinos. And then she's described as representative for the Golden Girls. So the older women. So there's also this, oh, yeah, no, she's sitting at the table with black and white women who are all more mature. And so, so I think it adds more texture to that, right, in terms of thinking about the ways that her age is being figured there as a disability, right, her falling asleep, right, in mid-sentence, right, is as much about her age as anything else, too, so. Yeah, well, no, it's...
Thank you for that addition to the discussion. Other comments, questions? Please.
Thank you. So my question is one about materiality, and this is for both of you, so I'll just hand off however, but I was thinking about your comment about sort of putting things that are proximate to disability or that look like disability and what avenues that opens up. And that's the same gesture that you offer in your book that just came out. And I was also thinking in your context, Anne, about visual representation. But I wondered if both of you could say a little bit more about materiality in those contexts. So, I mean, I think there's a push in disability studies right now of a real kind of return to the body, which sounds sort of funny, but in the sense that there's ways that theorizing something, sometimes the body can fall out. And so interest in pain and, you know, tactility. And so when you think about, I guess for you, when you think about visual representation and, you know, curating exhibits, and I mean, how does the materiality and the real sort of embodiment, how does that factor into the equation? And when you're thinking more theoretically about proximate bodies and what of the bodies themselves, does that make sense as a question? Okay.
I know, right? It's a really, thank you for that question, Allison. I mean, it's really multi-layered. I would say it's interesting in my own work, the materiality question has become really important, both curatorially and in the classroom. When I taught, so for example, when I taught this disability and literature seminar this spring, and Davidson College was very generous and gave me a grant to take the whole class up to DC to go to the Smithsonian, I thought, well, what am I doing? This is a disability and literature class. I'm not sure walking them through these artifacts, while interesting, is really going to do, what is it going to do? And it really did enhance those discussions that we already see theoretically, right? Where we have to caution against romanticizing the disabled body out of existence, or becoming so theoretically, you know, focused on constructions like the cyborg that we romanticize disability at a distance. So I took my students to the Smithsonian, and there were two moments that I think were really profound that were reminders for students of culture and literature about the bodies behind the representations. One was in which Catherine Ott put a straitjacket in my arms. And just to feel the weight of that was an experience that we can talk about. I'm writing on Next to Normal and how it visualizes electroconvulsive therapy, but to have the weight of that thing in my arms was a completely different material engagement with the physicality of disability. And then another thing we saw were a set of lobotomy knives, which look very innocuous if you don't know what they are. They look like knitting needles. And so to sort of see these exquisitely crafted objects, but then to learn their history, it was a pretty profound moment, and the students were a little bit shaken even. And so I think the engagement for me with the material as a literary scholar has been important. In terms of my curatorial work, it's a really interesting question because as you know, I'm curating this exhibition on HIV/AIDS for a show that's going to open next year. And so the question becomes, how do we find all those ways in through the material object of art into the experience of HIV across this long continuum of experience? And so we're trying to understand both that individuated experience of HIV/AIDS, but also the quest, but the intersection between the social and the scientific quest for knowledge about the illness. And so how does art clue us into those different ways of struggling toward knowledge, both of the individual patient about their own illness, but also the researcher trying to find the answers for treatment? So I don't know if that's a great answer to your question, but that's sort of how I've been engaging the questions of materiality.
Wow, let's see. I think it is a great question. And for me, there are so many different meanings of materiality. And it comes down to a couple of questions. One is, what counts as a body? So when I think about environmental illness, I think about the ways that seemingly exogenous, inhuman substances like certain kinds of chemicals cannot be processed well and end up intoxicating, and I'm using that word intentionally, end up intoxicating a human, right? And so where do we draw the line in thinking about that body? Or should we perhaps be talking about that amalgam of those bodies, including the human and the chemicals? And I think I take an autobiographical turn within my book precisely to try to get at these questions of where my body ends and where another body begins. And also, if I become kind of inanimated by the chemicals and my couch becomes somehow more animated as the thing that I lovingly interface with, then what's happening, right? And so these are absolutely embodied experiences, and it's a way of learning, like crypt dancing, that changes what I might have formally thought about what chemicals do to human bodies. And I suspect the same is true for you, Veronica. So I think, yeah.
Thank you. I just want to be mindful of the time. It's 2 o'clock, and some of us, meaning me, have to leave. And I want to invite you to continue this discussion with these fabulous individuals, as well as with Lori and Veronica, and Francis is still here, and Michael is in the back, that we have such a richness here today, and we're very thankful for everything.